Hello, it is Sunday, the 1st of January 2023. I am going to ring in the new year doing what I was doing last year, which is to say, crapping on about LaserDiscs. So this is a box of LaserDiscs that I bought from a seller in America. So I got this online a couple of months ago. I can't quite remember what is in here. But they are all movies that I have seen, so it's not going to be like that first video I did where I was surprised by movies I'd never heard of, like Avalanche Express and Colonel Culpepper's Flying Circus. So this is a bit of a lucky dip. So let's have a look at precisely what I paid for.
All right, American Graffiti.
Yeah, sorry, that is my very bad Wolfman Jack impersonation. So yes, this is the Laserdisc for American Graffiti, the 1973 motion picture directed and co-written by George Lucas. It was George Lucas's second feature film. He did this one just before Star Wars, of course. So this is a Laserdisc from 1981. So this Laserdisc is as old as I am. So American Graffiti, I have to be honest, American Graffiti is one of my favorite films. I absolutely love American Graffiti. So it's sort of it's kind of like a coming of age nostalgia, bittersweet sort of comedy film. These young people, their sort of last night before they break up. So it was made in 1973, and it's set in 1962. It's got a cast of then unknowns, that sort of most of whom went on to become really big names, like Richard Dreyfuss, Ron Howard, Charles Martin Smith, Paul Le Mat, Cindy Williams, and then you've got a lot of other people in this, like Harrison Ford, Bo Hopkins, Kathleen Quinlan. Wolfman Jack appears in this as himself, Mackenzie Phillips. So this is a film that I saw. I watched this film a lot on cable back in the sort of 1996, 97. And it's interesting, I think, as a nostalgia film, because the levels of it, it's like in 1973, it was a nostalgia film about 1962. And then I guess moving into the 1980s, the nostalgia from watching it was like watching all these young actors when they were young, who were sort of grown up and transitioned into more adult roles. When I watch it, the nostalgia I feel is for 1996, because when I watch this movie, it just instantly takes me back to the when I watched this movie a lot. It's got a really great soundtrack. This Lucas actually. This movie was supposed to be. It's sort of like a musical, but like a musical that has just comprises songs on the radio or songs that the characters are listening to. It was kind of the first big like oldies soundtrack, that sort of like 50s style rock and roll revival, the nostalgia wave of in the 1970s. It was a big thing, which sort of fed into stuff like Happy Days and Grease and such like. But yeah, this is a really great film. Even just the end with that sort of the melancholy postscripts about what happens to the characters, and like then the opening notes of the Beach Boys, All Summer Long, kicks in. To this day, All Summer Long strikes me as a really sad song, just because of the way it's used at the end of this film. So really. Yeah, really happy to get this. There was a lesser known sequel in 1979, More American Graffiti, which reunited most of the cast except for Richard Dreyfuss. It's not a very good movie overall, but it's got some segments in it that are pretty good. The stuff with Charles Martin Smith in Vietnam is really good. The film was produced by Francis Ford Coppola, Lucas's friend and mentor, and the cinematography is by Haskell Wexler. It's really good. It's such a gorgeous film. It really makes very effective use of the suburban Californian sprawl with the lights, the neon lights and the roads and everything. It's funny because you sort of think of the passage of time. I mean, the film was made. It came out in 1973. It's set in 1962, so only 11 years after it was set. And yet the film, its setting is 1962, so it's still very much indebted to the aesthetic of the 1950s. So it's pre Beatlemania, it's pre Kennedy assassination, And then when the film was made in 1973, so only 11 years later, that is post, sort of America sort of gone through the JFK assassination, like hippie folk rock, acid rock, the Beatles, all the political assassinations, Altamont, Nixon, Watergate. It's like in a space of a little over a decade, it just feels like the socio-cultural political landscape is just like massively changed. And so, yeah, I don't think that the world has changed as much in the past, 11 years as it did between 1962 and 1973. But, maybe there are some, sociologists who will correct me on that point. I'm not sure if American Graffiti invented the, one crazy night, like last day of high school genre. I think maybe it did, but yeah, it was a massively influential film. I mean, I don't think Dazed and Confused, for one thing, would have come into existence if not for this film. But yeah, American Graffiti, great film. Really, really happy to have this on Laserdisc. There was a Lucas did actually restore some footage to the film after its initial theatrical release, which I think is the standard version of the film that's on VHS and DVD and Blu-ray, etc. I assume that it's this Laserdisc also features that slightly extended edition. So this is the Laserdisc for Altered States, the 1980 science fiction horror film directed by Ken Russell. So this is a Warner Home Video release, and if you've seen any of my previous videos, you'll know that I'm a big fan of these Warner Home Video sleeves. Okay, so Altered States. This was based on the 1980 novel by Paddy Chayefsky, but Ken Russell and Paddy Chayefsky had a massive falling out, and so the screenplay is officially credited to Sidney Aaron, which is Paddy Chayefsky's pseudonym. So the film, it's based on the sensory deprivation research by John Lilly in the 1960s. So in this movie, it's about a research scientist who experiments with hallucinogenic drugs and a sensory deprivation tank. And he sort of the experiments on himself. He sort of ends up regressing, like sort of de-evolving into an atavistic state. He becomes like a feral monkey man. And sort of causes all sorts of havoc. The film was originally going to be directed by Arthur Penn, who I believe assembled most of the cast that ended up working for Ken Russell. So you've got William Hurt, you got Blair Brown, Bob Balaban, Charles Hayde. It's a really good cast. It's a really good movie. I feel. It's a movie where Ken Russell's flamboyant touches, hallucinogenic imagery and such like it really works. I think that although there was obviously the falling out between Chayefsky and Russell, I think that if you don't like this movie, I think it's more on Chayefsky, because the film is actually amazingly faithful to the novel, the 1978 Chayefsky novel. Yeah, and it's there's a really good film score by John Corigliano as well. And it's there's just the imagery in this film is just really fantastic. It's just a very atmospheric film that's sort of, it's got an interesting premise and it executes it in a very imaginative way. It's not a perfect film. It does have some flaws. I sort of admire the fact that William Hurt's character, Eddie Jessup, he's not a very likable character at all. There's that kind of as a sort of a sort of an arrogant, spiky scientist who sort of eventually gets in over his head. Like, it's a sort of role that William Hurt is just really good at. I'm not 100% sure, but I think Altered States might be William Hurt's first film. It's certainly his first lead performance in a film. I think this film might be the reason I've stayed away from both hallucinogenic drugs and sensory deprivation tanks. I think this. Not that I had any great ambitions in those fields anyway, but I think this really put me off. Okay, so this is a 1983 Vestron video laserdisc for Brian De Palma's Blowout, the movie from 1981. Okay, so yeah, starring John Travolta and Nancy Allen. Yeah, Blowout is a great film. It's possibly Brian De Palma's best film. Sort of a uh, uh, political thriller. It's possibly the most De Palma movie that Brian De Palma made. It's like the culmination of all of his obsessions. It's violence, voyeurism, sex, conspiracy, the mechanics of filmmaking itself. So it stars John Travolta as a sound recordist, a movie sound recordist, and then he accidentally records a an accident involving a political candidate, and then he's just from there on he's just thrown into this kind of mystery that involves Nancy Allen and government assassins, and it's sort of the film. It has like traces of the JFK assassination, Chappaquiddick, Watergate. John Lithgow plays a really really creepy government assassin in this. It's just, and there are just so many great set pieces. It's set in Philadelphia. Yeah, it's just a fantastic movie. So I mean, De Palma made it after Dress to Kill, which was a huge hit, and then he made this movie. And this movie actually, it got some really good reviews, but it really bombed. And I think the sort of the depressing ending really. I think audiences just hated it because of the ending. So its reputation has improved. I mean, the next film De Palma made after this was Scarface in 1983. But yeah, I think this is definitely one of De Palma's best films. It's possibly John Travolta's best lead performance in a film. I think it's Saturday Night Fever, this movie, and Pulp Fiction are his three best films. I think De Palma was reluctant to cast Nancy Allen in this, but I think John Travolta wanted her in this. I mean, Nancy Allen was married to De Palma at the time, but Travolta and Nancy Allen had played a couple in De Palma's Carrie in 1976, and I think Travolta really wanted to work with her again, and she's really good in this. Yeah, I would really love to see this film on the big screen on one day. It's got a music score by Pino Donaggio, an Italian composer who's worked with De Palma quite a few times, and it's very sort of a lush, melodramatic score. It's really good. So it's written and directed by De Palma, and the cinematography is by Vilmos Zsigmond, and the editing is by Paul Hirsch. It's just a bunch of superb film craftsmen, just at their absolute peak. Yeah. So Blowout. Yeah, great film. This is a 1983 CBS Fox laserdisc of Lenny, the Bob Fosse film from 1974. So starring Dustin Hoffman as the seminal stand-up comedian Lenny Bruce. Yeah, so this is a really good film. I've talked about Bob Fosse before. This was Fosse's third film as director. So he'd done Sweet Charity and he did Cabaret, and then he did Lenny. So this is the first film he made after Cabaret, which had won Fosse a Best Director Academy Award. Yeah, so Fosse was, I believe he was still doing post-production of Lenny when he was staging the musical Chicago, and all that work, and as well as the drugs and whatnot. It sent him to he had the first of several heart attacks, and I think he ended up in a mental institution for a while. So yeah, this is a good film. It's filmed in black and white. I think all of Fosse's films, to varying degrees, are like explorations of the dark, seamy underbelly of show business, and this is an example of that. Dustin Hoffman is really good in this. I think there are some Lenny Bruce purists who find fault with his Hoffman's characterization in this, but I mean, I haven't actually seen much at all of the real footage of the real Lenny Bruce. So I've got no basis for comparison. I can only go by Dustin Hoffman's performance in this film, and I think it's really good. Valerie Perrine is in this, as well as as Lenny Bruce's wife, and she's really good in this film as well. Yeah, so I think the film was based on a play about Lenny Bruce that I think Cliff Gorman played on stage, and Cliff Gorman doesn't play Lenny Bruce in this, but when Fosse made All That Jazz, which is a sort of semi-autobiographical film about himself, there are sequences of Fosse's the Fosse character, Joe Gideon, played by Roy Scheider, editing a movie. I think it's called The Comedian, which is obviously supposed to be Lenny, and I think Cliff Gorman plays the Lenny Bruce character in that. Yeah, so the film is set between 1951 and 1961. It's kind of a, I mean, it's kind of a depressing, depressing sort of film to watch if you know anything about Lenny Bruce. But you know, it's really good. Hoffman was, I'm pretty sure he was nominated for a Best Actor Academy Award, along with Al Pacino for Godfather Part 2 and Jack Nicholson for Chinatown. I mean, any three of those guys should have won. I mean, I probably would have gone for Pacino, and in the end, they gave it to Art Carney for Harry and Tonto, which, you know, it's Harry and Tonto is a good movie, and Art Carney is good in it, but yeah, I think the Academy really dropped the ball when they were handing out the awards that year. This is a laserdisc for Platoon, the 1986 Vietnam War film, written and directed by Oliver Stone. So this is released by this laserdisc was released by HBO. So yeah, this won the Academy Award for Best Picture, Platoon. This is a film that sort of puts Oliver Stone on the map as a director. So he'd had quite a few screenplay credits prior to this. He'd won an Academy Award for his screenplay for Midnight Express in 1978. So he directed, he actually had two films that came out in 1986. He had Salvador, which came out earlier in the year, didn't really do too well. Then he had Platoon, which came out later on and was a huge hit, a huge critical hit. And that sort of led to the reevaluation of Salvador. I think actually James Woods, who starred in Salvador, got an Academy Award nomination after Platoon became big. So yeah, this is a really good film. I mean, there are quite a few really good films about the Vietnam War. This is you know, obviously one of the most famous. It's semi autobiographical. The character, so it's based on Oliver Stone's time in service in Vietnam in the 1960s, where he was wounded. He was wounded in action. So you got Charlie Sheen playing the Oliver Stone analog. And he's sort of caught between two very different sergeants, one played by Tom Berenger and one played by Willem Dafoe. Yeah, it's just a really good cast as well. Lots of you know, young actors. It's a very atmospheric film. It was you know, I think it was sort of a cathartic thing. This film was released because it was kind of it was a film that I think resonated very strongly with America and with veterans. Yeah, and the casting is really good. The casting of Willem Dafoe is interesting because prior to this point, the casting of Willem Dafoe and Tom Berenger, because they were both sort of cast against type. Because Tom Berenger, who sort of prior to this had, you know, he'd played like sort of, you know, rugged, you know, handsome, you know, leading man types, and in this he's cast as a, you know, a scarred, psychotic character. And Willem Dafoe, who prior to this was known mainly for his villainous roles, like in Streets of Fire and To Live and Die in L.A. But Oliver Stone, I think I read somewhere that Oliver Stone sort of saw a gentleness and a beauty in Willem Dafoe, and he's cast in this as Sergeant Elias, the sort of the kind of the Christ-like character of this film, who sort of dies rather famously in a crucifixion pose there. Yeah, so there was sort of towards the end of the, I mean, in the late 70s, like not long after the Vietnam War ended, there were films like there was like Apocalypse Now, Go Tell the Spartans, Coming Home, The Deer Hunter, and then this is sort of part of the second wave of Vietnam films, that the ones that were released towards the end of the 1980s. So you had Platoon in 1986. There was Full Metal Jacket in 1987. There was Casualties of War in 1989. There was also Hamburger Hill. I'm not sure what year that was. I think that was somewhere in the late 1980s as well. Yeah, so this is I really like that design. It's very minimalist. It's very good. I love that logo. Okay, Poltergeist 2, The Other Side. So this is a laserdisc from MGM UA from 1986. Okay, so Poltergeist 2, right. So this is the sequel to Poltergeist, the 1982 film Poltergeist, which I have talked about in a previous video. So Poltergeist was 1982, Poltergeist 2 was 1986, so it's 4 years later. I've watched Poltergeist, the original Poltergeist, lots and lots of times. I haven't watched Poltergeist 2 anywhere near as much. I've seen it, I've seen it a few times. Yeah, it's a film where, I mean, it's Steven Spielberg and Tobe Hooper, who produced and directed the original Poltergeist, they didn't have anything to do with this one, although some of the writers from the first film were involved in the second one. Poltergeist 2, it's a film where it's got some good things in it, but overall the film is not. I don't think the film is especially satisfying. So I mean, the things that work in it. Okay, so Jerry Goldsmith, who did the music score for Poltergeist, he came back and did the music score for Poltergeist 2 as well. And it's a really, really fantastic score. I do heartily recommend just getting your hands on the Jerry Goldsmith's soundtrack. It's really good. And it actually doesn't even really rely that much on cues from the first film. It's pretty much its own entity, but it's a very effective score. It's very creepy. It uses a lot of like gothic chanting, a bit like what Goldsmith did with The Omen in 1976. It's a really good score. It's a much better score than the film deserves, I think. And it's got a lot more like synthesized, like electronic sounds than the original score. The other thing I really like about this is the performance of Julian Beck, who plays the villain Reverend Henry Kane. So Julian Beck is a really interesting character. He was in real life, he was involved in experimental theater, and he was terminally ill when he agreed to be in this movie. So this is his last performance, and he does look very cadaverous as Reverend Kane, who's like this sort of creepy, demonic preacher, sort of cult leader. It's a really good his performance. He's really creepy and terrifying. I think Reverend Kane is actually one of the best like ghouls I have ever seen in a horror film. He's probably, if anything, he's not in this movie enough. I think he died. I'm pretty sure he completed most of his scenes, but I think he died in post production. They did bring the character of Reverend Kane back in Poltergeist 3 a couple of years later, but he's played by a different actor, Nathan Davis. And I really wish they didn't, because Julian Beck is Reverend Kane with no substitute. So the film it continues the story of the Freeling family, who were like bedeviled by malevolent spirits in the first Poltergeist movie. I think one of my problems with this film is that if I feel that the original Poltergeist was fairly self-contained, and if they were going to do a follow-up, I think the Freeling story, ended rather satisfactorily at the end of the first film. I think they should have just gone with a new cast, but again, audience recognition. I guess there was no way that that they were going to do that. They were going to carry on, but I feel like it kind of devalues the original story by having the creepy spirits like pursuing the family across America, and they sort of have to create like convoluted reasons for why they're still being harassed by these otherworldly entities, and I think it kind of. I think it's to an extent it sort of retcons the original movie, and yeah, I don't like the fact that the character of Dana Freeling, the teenage daughter from the first film, so she's not in this because obviously Dominique Dunne, the actress who played Dana, was tragically murdered in 1982, not long after Poltergeist was released, and it's like. There's absolutely no explanation for where her character is. I understand that, I think there was supposed to be a line that said she was at college or something, but they just don't address it at all. It's kind of like, I think, maybe they thought they were being sensitive to Dominique Dunne, but it's like they've just like erased that character from existence. There's absolutely no mention of her, as if it's like she never existed, which kind of doesn't really wash with me. Yeah, another thing about Poltergeist 2, it's a sort of film where it's not a very long film. I think it's only like about 92 minutes long, and it definitely feels like a movie that probably would have been better and would have made more sense in an earlier cut, but they just sort of pruned it down. And I think I don't think there'll ever be an extended version of this film, but it definitely feels like there are scenes missing. Yeah, overall it has a very schlocky sort of feel to it. Like it has some pretty good scare scenes, but it's almost like they just came up with the set pieces and then just sort of constructed like a flimsy storyline to connect them together. Yeah, and it's got this like really goofy stuff about Carol Ann, being clairvoyant and stuff. It's just so it's okay. It's not a bad movie. It's just not an especially good one. The film sort of leans on Native American mysticism, or I guess white people's interpretation of it. It was directed by Brian Gibson, who was a British filmmaker, I think, and it's got there are some creature designs that were based on designs by H.R. Giger, who did work for Alien. I don't think Yeah, I can't remember if Giger was especially pleased with what they'd done with his design. There's a pretty good theatrical trailer of Poltergeist 2, which is really just it comprises mostly an isolated scene of Reverend Kane stalking the family, and then there's like a quick cut montage of sequences from the film. And the trailer is the trailer I think is better than the movie. It certainly gives the impression of a film that is far scarier than what it actually is. This is a Paramount home video laserdisc release from 1984 of The Dead Zone, the 1983 David Cronenberg adaptation of Stephen King's The Dead Zone. This is one of my favorite. This is one of my favorite films, the Dead Zone. So it was. So the Stephen King novel is from 1979, and Cronenberg made the film adaptation in 1983. So prior to this, David Cronenberg had directed, I think, about a half dozen films. Most of them were self-initiated projects, like films he'd written himself. He'd done Videodrome just before this one, and then I think at this point, just for a change of pace, Cronenberg wanted to do something that someone else had written. So he wanted to just be a work for hire, just as a just to recharge his batteries, so to speak. So there were a lot of Stephen King adaptations coming out. At this point, like Stephen King was really huge, and Dino De Laurentiis had the rights to the Dead Zone. I think Stanley Donen, surprisingly, was supposed to direct this. But anyway, so Dino De Laurentiis offered it to Cronenberg, who agreed to make it. The screenplay is officially credited to Jeffrey Boehm. Cronenberg said that Stephen King actually did a screenplay of the novel that was really bad, and Cronenberg didn't want to use it because he felt that it wasn't faithful enough to the novel. And Cronenberg said, ironically, that if he had made the film based on Stephen King's script, Stephen King's fans would have blamed him for the movie. So the screenplay is by Jeffrey Boehm, although I understand that Cronenberg had a hand in writing it as well, sans credit. The film stars Christopher Walken as a schoolteacher, Johnny Smith, who's involved in a car accident that puts him in a coma for 5 years. And when he awakes, he discovers he has the ability to, if he touches people, he can see into their past and see into their future. And then he sort of, because he feels that he has to live as an outcast because of he's got these terrifying powers. But then he sort of faces up to his responsibility to use his abilities, first to help catch a serial killer, and then when he touches the hand of a political candidate, he has this like horrifying vision of the future. And then it's like, what steps does he have to take to stop this person from ever attaining political power? So yeah, it's got an absolutely fantastic cast. You've got Christopher Walken, you've got Brooke Adams, Tom Skerritt, Herbert Lom, Colin Dewhurst, Nicholas Campbell. Martin Sheen is in this as the political villain, Greg Stilson. He's actually really good in this. He's really terrifying as Greg Stilson. The music's by Michael Kamen, really good music score. I think the cinematography was by Mark Irwin, who collaborated with Cronenberg quite a lot. It's produced by Deborah Hill, who did Halloween. Yeah, so this is a really good film. It's actually it's one of my favorite Cronenberg films, and I think it's one of the best Stephen King adaptations. There are other adaptations of Stephen King, like I think Firestarter, which came out just after this one, where you start off with like a massive 500-page book, and you sort of they whittle it down, but they don't really do a very good job. Whereas The Dead Zone is like the perfect. I think it's a perfect example of when you can streamline a film, like sort of distill it, into a digestible movie, and without losing the spirit of the work. It's quite a faithful adaptation, and it doesn't really lose anything essential, but it sort of does it does a really good job. And so this was Cronenberg's first. It was like I think it was his first film, his first genre film rather, that sort of moved away from body horror. It's much more of a supernatural psychological thriller, although it does have some very violent sequences in it. There's a sequence involving a pair of scissors that a lot of people remember. Yeah, and I think what surprised a lot of people who were familiar with Cronenberg's work prior to this is that the film, there is a I guess a humanity to this film that is maybe not so much lacking, but perhaps it isn't especially overt in Cronenberg's previous films. There was a TV remake of The Dead Zone many years later, starring Anthony Michael Hall. I seem to remember it was pretty. It was pretty good. Although I can't remember how long it lasted for. I only saw the first couple of seasons, so I don't know how well it held up to the end. Crystal Walken also parodied his role in this film rather memorably once on Saturday Night Live in the Ed Glosser Trivial Psychic sketch. And with that, I say, Happy New Year.